The Majority Report with Sam Seder.
The destiny of America is always safer in the hands of the people than in the conference rooms of any elite.
Sam Seder.
They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
The Majority Report with Sam Seder.
Ever get the feeling you've been cheated?
It is Tuesday, April 30th, 2019. My name is Sam Seder. This is the 5-time award-winning Majority Report. We are broadcasting live steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. On the program today, Professor of History at Northwestern University, Daniel Immerwahr, on how to hide an empire, a history of the greater United States. Also on the program today, impeachment talk increases as Trump's stonewalling increases, including a lawsuit against Deutsche Bank and Capital One to block release of financial records to Congress. Also on the program today, Trump to charge refugees fees for asylum. Rod Rosenstein resigns, praising Donald Trump's good humor. And Mike Pompeo praises our involvement in the Yemen slaughter. Meanwhile, Joe Biden staking out the Republican lane in the Democratic primary. And Democrats fight to maintain the promise of loan relief for public workers. And in Ohio Republicans remind us that the problem is Republicans. And lastly, the U.S. cheers on an attempted coup going down right about now in Venezuela. All this and more on today's program, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the program. Everyone's here today. Jamie is back from her... Where did you go, Jamie?
First I went upstate to work on my book proposal and freak out about that. And then I went to the 24-hour drone festival, which was, as always, a transcendent experience.
I don't even know what that means. What does that mean?
Drone music?
Oh, okay.
It's like repeating tone.
I thought you were saying...
Not the kind that fly in the
I think you
sky.
made the same mistake last year, actually.
I did?
Yeah.
I guess I didn't pick up that. Where is the drone festival?
It's at Basilica Hudson, which is a beautiful former factory building owned by Melissa Aufdermar and her filmmaker husband.
I know that place very, very well.
Cool.
My daughter has gone to camp right next to the Basilica.
Oh my God.
Yeah, I didn't realize.
This one, my experience was not for kids, I'll tell you that much, this past weekend.
I can only imagine.
Not for beginners.
I can only imagine. All right, folks. Couple of emails I got from listeners that I want to share with you because longtime listeners, both. One is from listener Alex. Hey, I'm our crew. It's my brother's Spencer's birthday, and I was hoping you could give him a shofar. He did the same for my birthday, and it made my day. We are both daily listeners and members. He was going to get me a membership for my birthday, but found out I had already joined. Keep fighting the good fight. Pajama boys and girls. Left is best. And I'm going to combine that shofar with one from Film Fest guy, longtime listener, associated with the Film Archives. Could I have a birthday shout out? It was my 50th this past Saturday. Welcome to it, buddy. And to both you guys, happy birthday. Thanks for your continued listenership. Much appreciated. All All right, let's go to this. Ben Shapiro still on the. It seems like every week he's got a new favorite freshman woman congressperson that he is obsessing about.
I think Ilhan's his favorite.
Ilhan is his favorite now. Well, because, in the attempt to deny the obvious truth that hate crimes against Muslims, against Jews, against really anybody who is not white in this country or not Christian has gone up since the entrance into the race by Donald Trump. And the Republican Party, which enabled Donald Trump's rise, which trained its electorate to vote for a guy like this, that has excused time and time again rhetoric that ranges from, I'm sure there's some decent non-rapist Mexicans, to, we're going to ban Muslim countries, Muslim immigrants, to just, we're going to charge refugees money if they're seeking asylum, and on and on and on. I'm sure there are good people on both sides, the whole thing. In their desperate attempt to hide and deny their own complicity in this stuff, whether they dress it up as like, we're just exploring ideas here. We're rebels. We're talking about stuff that was, hasn't been as popular since we were talking about eugenics or something. They are constantly looking for other people to blame for what they know ultimately is a function of their politics. And here is Ben Shapiro trying to somehow tie Ilhan Omar into the white supremacist who shot up a synagogue a couple of days ago.
As I said before, if you are blind to anti-Semitism from one particular side of the aisle because it favors your political position, you are not in the fight against anti-Semitism. You are part of the problem. If anti-Semitism is just another political club to be wielded, if Ilhan Omar...
Pause it. It's just amazing because one could be forgiven for assuming that was the way he was about to introduce his apology. Right. When anti-Semitism is just simply used as a political club. And with that said, I had an epiphany last night and I'm going to retire. And I'm going to go work somewhere else and do something else with my life because I realize what I have been doing has been so wrong. But instead, he turns to Ilhan Omar.
You're part of the problem. If anti-Semitism is just another political club to be wielded, if Ilhan Omar is given the credibility to speak out against anti-Semitism while routinely engaging in anti-Semitism, she has a lot of the same opinions about Jews that the white supremacist had in that manifesto. In that manifesto, the shooter basically effectively says about Jews that they control the world media, that they control the way money runs, that they control opinion about Israel. Am I going to take...
Pause it. Now, Ilhan Omar has said none of those things. None of the things she's ever said could even be remotely interpreted by that. The closest she's ever said is that the PAC that has in its mission statement to impact the public opinion of Israel in this country, does it by expending money on candidates. Just like Thomas Friedman said, although Thomas Friedman said it a little more aggressively and a little more pointedly and a little bit more studiously. But she never said any of the things he's lying about now. So just think how decrepit you have to be in your brain to make this case that we shouldn't politicize anti-Semitism as you are lying to politicize anti-Semitism and basically comparing Ilhan Omar to a white supremacist who has just shot somebody up and he has to lie about the similarities in their manifesto. And I want you to keep that in mind we don't need to hear Ben Shapiro anymore, because Ben Shapiro, when we talk about manifestos, when we talk about the implications, and I don't know what the point is he's making, that Ilhan Omar and he lies about her opinions are similar to those of the shooter. But we know for a fact that the guy who shot up in Canada, which number is this one that we have here? The Quebec City mosque shooter. In the Washington Post, the guy's name, Bissonnette, appears to have obsessively visited the Twitter accounts of Tucker Carlson and Laura Ingraham, David Duke, Alex Jones, Mike Cernovich, Richard Spencer, and Bissonnette checked on the Twitter account of Ben Shapiro 93 times in the month leading up to the shooting. So if you want to talk about similarities in perspective, if you want to talk about inspiration for attacks like these, here's a video. Who did this video?
This is a clip from Vic Berger.
Vic Berger did a video comparing the rhetoric from Shapiro with the testimony, not the testimony, the interrogation of this guy Bissonnette. Listen to this.
Many Muslims are trying to kill Jews. End of story. This idea, we are all Muslim, no, we aren't. And the only people who think we are leftists who are fully insane, or Muslims who believe that we all should be Muslims and that they get to kill us if we disagree. So all of this politically correct nonsense, it's going to get a lot of people killed. They're coming for Western civilization. A lot more people will die because there are people who believe we are all Muslims.
Here's Bissonnette. I wanted to save people. Save people, they ask? Yes. From terrorist attacks.
How many Americans have to die for this crap?
I mean, I don't know if I can say that Shapiro inspired this guy, but we do know in terms of factually, this guy was obsessively checking the messages he was getting from Shapiro, and that his perspective, his fears, were completely aligned with the warnings that Shapiro was giving. So it's really stunning for this guy to come out and say this type of stuff.
If we're talking about manifestos, I actually read the one from the New Zealand guy, and I would like to see Ben Shapiro explicitly say how his views on the dangers of Muslim immigration differ from those expressed in those manifestos.
That would be very interesting to hear.
I mean, it's pretty shocking to hear Ben Shapiro going out and trying to make this argument.
Yeah, and he can stop using all Jews as an excuse, by the way, because most Jews do not agree with him.
Well, he would not, to be fair, he would not consider those Jews to be Jews. Because Ben Shapiro, completely inconsistent with with Jewish tradition, feels that he is the Pope of the Jews, apparently.
I'm the Pope of the Jews.
Or he certainly, it appears to act that way.
Animus piesus.
Folks, reminder, the New Yorker magazine represents the best writing in America today. Both online and in print, the New Yorker covers a full range of topics, including politics, news, international affairs, climate change, popular culture, the arts, fiction, food, humor, cartoons, not to mention the New Yorker touches on subjects that many readers may not have previously put much thought into, like the world's diminishing supply of sand, or paper jams, or stink bugs. I think about stink bugs quite a bit, actually. Hunting down heirloom beans. Some of the New Yorker's incredible writers include contributors like Ronan Farrow, who broke the news on Harvey Weinstein, and Les Moonves, and Helen Rosner, a James Beard award-winning food writer who contributes essays and report stories on all things gastronomic. We spoke about a New Yorker story yesterday involving the grift that is the NRA. You can go check out a profile on John Bolton that's in the piece now. Basically, Bolton's attempt to sell Donald Trump on neoconservatism again. There's a piece on the return of al-Baghdadi from ISIS. There is things, billionaires and Jack Dorsey's TED interview. That's the guy from Twitter.
It was very informational.
I bet.
Extremely so.
We're all in good hands.
Yeah, exactly. Everything's going to be fine. Anyways, if you're not reading The New Yorker, you're not reading anything, frankly. And now our listeners can save 50% and get 12 weeks of The New Yorker for just $6 when you go to newyorker.com/majority and enter the coupon code majority. You'll also get an exclusive tote as well as unlimited access to the New Yorker's apps, online archive, crossword puzzle, and newyorker.com with 10 to 15 exclusive site-only stories every day. That's newyorker.com/majority. Enter majority. 50% off. 12 weeks in the New Yorker for just $6. Give me a break. Also, as you know, Third Love, a sponsor of this program, they have more than 70 sizes, including their signature half-cup sizes. Third Love designs bras with breast size and shape in mind for a perfect fit, premium feel. You just answer a few simple questions via Third Love's Fit Finder quiz to find your perfect fit in 60 seconds. Then, thanks to Third Love's 100% fit guarantee, you can wear, wash, and put your bra to the test for 60 days. And if you don't love it, you can return it, and Third Love will wash it and donate it to a woman in need. This is hands down the most comfortable bra you'll own. Our official tester writes, the fit is great. I usually have to return most bras I order online. Even though they're in my size, I ordered 2 and both fit. That almost never happens. Super comfortable for an everyday bra, but not as boring as most t-shirt bras. Subtle, cute details, so I don't feel basic. They have straps that won't slip, tagless labels, lightweight, super thin memory foam cups. Not to mention, they have a new line of incredibly soft, smooth, and breathable cotton bras. Third Love knows there's a perfect bra for everyone, so right now they're offering my listeners 15% off your first order. Go to thirdlove.com/majority now to find your perfect fitting bra and get 15% off your first purchase. That's thirdlove.com/majority for 15% off today. And lastly, Mother's Day is coming up, and there's nothing we wouldn't do to make sure the special moms in our lives are happy. Shari's Berries has a special Mother's Day berries designed just for mom. They're topped with chocolate chips, pink shimmer sugar, and swizzles. They're beautiful, folks. And you choose your delivery date to ensure that mom gets you your gift to Shari Berries exactly when you want her to. Better yet, your satisfaction is always guaranteed. Folks, we've gotten many shipments of Shari's Berries here. I'm literally...
maybe someday I'll get to try one before you eat them all.
I like them so much.
Maybe.
Hello.
I do have a bit of a problem with eating just one of them. They are delicious, and I wish I had more right now. But it's a great gift for mom. Don't wait to the last minute on this one, folks. Visit berries.com to order freshly dipped strawberries starting at $19.99 for moms in your life. And you can determine when they get delivered. So do it today so you don't forget. You only got about 10 days until Mother's Day. Less. Wait, what's today? No, about 10 days. 12 days. To make mom really happy, you can double the berries for just $10 more. Mother's Day is Sunday, May 12th. So visit berries.com. That's BERRIES.com. Then click on the microphone in the upper right-hand corner. Enter my code Seder, as in Seder, as in SEDER. That's berries.com. Click on the microphone, code Seder, SEDER. All right, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to be talking to Daniel Immerwahr on his book titled, where did I get it? Right here. How to Hide an Empire, A History of the Greater United States. We'll be right back. We are back. Sam Seder on the Majority Report on the phone. It is a pleasure to welcome to the program Professor of History at Northwestern University, Daniel Immerwahr, author of How to Hide an Empire, A History of the Greater United States. Daniel, welcome to the program.
It's a pleasure to be here.
All right, so let's just as an overview, this is almost like a geographic history of the empire of the United States. Why? What is it about knowing the geography as you track it over the course of a couple hundred years that is so important to our understanding of America as an entity, I guess?
Yeah, no, that's right. I start the book with maps, and one of the reasons I do that is that, frankly, I think a lot of people in the United States and a lot of people outside of the United States don't really have an accurate map of the full borders of the country in their head. So, if you ask most people, what does the U.S. look like on a map? They call to mind that familiar shape, just the contiguous blob with Mexico and Canada on the north and south and the oceans on either side. But the thing is, those have only been the borders of the United States for 3 years of its history. There's 3 years of U.S. history where those are the borders, partly because in the 18th and early 19th century, the United States was expanding, but because after it stopped sort of expanding in the contiguous North America, it started expanding overseas, taking first uninhabited islands in the Caribbean and the Pacific, and then taking large inhabited colonies. By the end of the 19th century, it had a very large and populous empire. And those overseas parts of the United States, both the colonies and then later on the military bases, hundreds of them that the United States claims, those are, I think, just don't really feature in most people's maps of the country. And as a result, they tell a truncated version of its history, a history that only is interested and only focuses on the mainland, and they miss a lot of the action when they do that.
And does it? And do we also? Does it have implications in terms of the character of the country? I mean, that we don't fully grasp the history, but do we not fully grasp? I guess I don't know. I'm just thinking, we're obviously it's primary season, and so we have a lot of candidates who talk about America as an idea, and I'm not sure I 100% know what that means. But does it implicate that idea?
I think it does, because the vision that you get of the United States, if you're just looking at what people in the territories call the mainland, first of all, it's a vision where Republican ideals hold not perfectly, but fairly well. Most people live in parts of the United States that allow them to vote, that allow them to have vote for representatives in Congress. Now, that's not true in D.C., so there are some little anomalies, and Native American lands have their own sort of legal arrangements. Nevertheless, you kind of feel like it's wall-to-wall carpeting in terms of the Republican system. Once you look at the other parts of the United States, the overseas parts, you realize that a big part of U.S. history is a peripheral zone, a zone that doesn't have representation in terms of the ability to vote for the president, doesn't have the ability to vote for delegates who then have voting power in Congress, and in many cases isn't even covered by the Constitution. So that's disenfranchisement or subordination by all three modes of government, and that is, I think, a serious cognitive dissonance or contradiction between the ideals of the country as we often articulate them and the ideals as they're actually lived.
I mean, I guess, and as we go through these sort of these eras, I mean, do we have an accounting of, particularly in that respect, of the numbers that we're talking about? I mean, how does that translate from at maybe high and low points in terms of just how many of those of people are in that sort of that area of they're not sovereign, but they're not in any way represented?
Sure. So we're at a relative low point right now. The United States still has 5 inhabited territories, and between 3 and 4 million people live in them. If you add Washington, D.C., that's a few more 100,000 people without full representation, the kind that citizens living in states have. But that's a relatively low point. If you go back to 1940, which is where I sort of open the book as I tell the story of how World War II comes to the territories. At that time, 19 million people who live in the United States, 19 million people who are U.S. nationals live off the mainland outside of the states. And just for some perspective, if you live in the United States, then there's a 1 in 8 chance that you're colonized, that you live in the territories, which means that you're more likely to be colonized than you are to be an immigrant. You're more likely to be colonized than you are to be African American by odds of 3 to 2. So this has been, at various points, a very substantial part of the United States' population. And even at times when, even in places where the populations are kind of low, small islands, military bases, which are relatively small enclaves, those spaces have also been really important to U.S. history beyond their effect of the people who live in them or right around them.
I want to start with Pearl Harbor and the story you tell about FDR and the way that he was sort of framing this for the estates. But it occurs to me as you're saying that about that sort of the really stunning number of people who are, disenfranchised is almost like an underwhelming word in that context. When we add that with slavery, where you had people obviously in probably material situations, perhaps even more oppressed, but certainly the number of we have had an expansive history of having dominion or control over people without their having any participation in what we perceive as the idea of America. That has been sort of more the norm than not.
Yeah, well, certainly it's been throughout U.S. history. Every day of U.S. history, there's some version of this going on. You can find some moment when the promises made turn out to be restricted to, in the 18th and 19th century, to a white settler population rather than to the full population of all the land in North America, which includes Native Americans, which includes enslaved African Americans. But what's really important to recognize, I think, is that colonialism is one of those important axes of subordination. Actually, it's a really big one. And so when we're talking about the ways in which people are disenfranchised or legally subordinated or sort of they don't count within the sort of sense of Washington of who matters and who doesn't, actually colonialism is a fairly big chunk of that, and certainly is so, especially in the first half of the 20th century.
So let's talk about the attack on Pearl Harbor, which in fact,
oh yeah, please.
Well, you may, I just found the whole thing sort of fascinating because I have always referred to it as the attack on Pearl Harbor, when in fact, in some respects, it was in terms of the war, it was not. It doesn't have the same relevance in terms of as all the other attacks that took place that day. But we don't have that in our consciousness because of I guess what the consciousness that Americans had of what constituted our territories at that time. Explain that.
Yeah, so Pearl Harbor is not really the best name for what happened. And the reason it's not the best name for what happened is that the attack began for the United States with an attack on the naval base Pearl Harbor in the territory of Hawaii, but it didn't stop there. In a near simultaneous attack, this all took place within hours. It's a little confusing because part of the attack took place on the other side of the international date line, and therefore it happened on December 8th, but this is all happening within a single solar day. The Japan attacks of the U.S. territories, Hawaii, Wake Island, which is an not indigenously inhabited but nevertheless occupied territory, Guam, and the single largest territory that the United States had ever held, which is the Philippines. And the reason that Pearl Harbor is not a particularly great descriptor for all of that is, first of all, it's not clear that that's even where the greatest military damage is done. The damage to the Philippines is quite serious and takes out the sort of pillar of air defense in the entire Pacific. But more importantly, the attack on Pearl Harbor is just an attack, whereas the attack on Guam, Wake Island, the Philippines, and then later Alaska, this wasn't in that day, but it happened within months, was a Japanese attack followed by more attacks, followed by invasion and occupation. And so, the largest colony that the United States had ever held, the Philippines, was occupied by Japan for years. It was a brutal occupation, and folks in the Philippines had a very different kind of war than people in Hawaii had.
In fact, by the end of World War II, Philippines had lost, what was it, 1.5 million people, or
1.6. Okay, so it depends on how you count. If you're asking how many Filipinos died in the Second World War, the government count is around 1.1 million. If you ask how many people died in the Philippines, and that so includes Japanese and that includes U.S. mainland service members, then it goes up to 1.6 million. But just to clarify, that makes World War II in the Philippines the bloodiest event that ever took place on U.S. soil. That's 2 civil wars. And yet you rarely hear about this in U.S. history textbooks, because the kind of U.S. history that we often do and teach in this country is a history of not the entire United States. It's a history of the mainland only. And so things that take place outside of the mainland don't seem to count as part of that history.
And talk about how FDR addressed the country, the United States, I guess the Americans, in sort of framing what happened on that day. And I guess the question I have as you explain it is it simply because this is not a teachable moment to explain how we've been, how many territories we have? Or is it that, this is not the vision that we have of ourselves, and so I don't want to really push that at this moment?
Yeah, so FDR faces a really interesting choice. And in fact, not just FDR. Anyone who's describing the attack that we now call Pearl Harbor, in those, hours and days after it, is facing an interesting question, which is how to describe what happened. And we've got a term for it, Pearl Harbor, but they didn't have that term. That was the name of the military base, the naval base, but no one called the full attack Pearl Harbor in the way that we did. That didn't come out for a few days. So you can just go through the newspaper headlines and see editors try to put a descriptor to it, or try to put a name to it, or try to say what happened. And often they would say that, well, a lot of things happened. Japan attacked Hawaii and Guam, or Japan attacked the Philippines and Hawaii. It wasn't clear where the focus needed to be. Eleanor Roosevelt gave a speech the night before, so before FDR's date, which will live in infamy speech, and she focused attention on Hawaii and the Philippines. And that's also how the draft of FDR's famous speech went. FDR produced that draft, and it was about Japanese attacks on Hawaii and the Philippines. And then you can just see FDR noodling with the draft. And when I say you can see it, I mean literally, because we actually have his marked up successive copies and his emendations and his deletions. And one thing he does is he takes out prominent references to the Philippines. He makes this a story about Hawaii. There's still a sort of back page reference to the Philippines. People don't always remember in that speech there, FDR gives a list of other places that Japan has attacked. It's an indiscriminate list, so it doesn't distinguish in any way between U.S. and foreign territory, and it's sort of tucked to the back of the speech. But nevertheless, the focus of that is on Hawaii, and it seems pretty clear to me why. I don't think this is a sort of grand conspiracy, but I think what FDR is responding to is that there is very little support on the U.S. mainland for a military defense of the Philippines, which is has a very small white population, is very far from the mainland, or for Guam. And there's more support, although even that is kind of wobbly, to use the U.S. military to defend the territory of Hawaii, which has a larger, although not majority, white population. And you can see FDR worry about even Hawaii, because the final edit he makes to the speech between the last draft that we have on paper and his actual spoken speech is that he inserts the word American in there before he describes the target in Hawaii, just to really underscore to his audience, and I think FDR was nervous about what his audience would hear, that Hawaii might sound foreign, might feel foreign, but actually is American territory, and therefore a Japanese attack on it is a cause for war.
So, all right, so let's go back and what is the genesis of? I mean, I guess the genesis of the American Empire begins as I guess settlers and colonialists start to move west, right? What is the genesis of this sort of lack awareness. I mean, and maybe this is like a generic shyness about being an empire, but it doesn't, like it seems to me like the British Empire was sort of, they were pretty psyched about making sure that everybody was aware that they were an empire. I don't get the same, you don't get the same sense of American history in that way.
Yeah. So two things. First of all, you're right that in some ways these questions of empire go back to day one, literally to day one, in that right after the United States is formally independent from Britain, so the treaty has been ratified by both sides, and now the country is independent. Its name is United States of America, which suggests that it's a union of states, but it's not. It's a union of, or it's not even a union, it's an amalgam of states and territories. The word union suggests voluntarily entered into. But the United States, from day one, has territories, in this case, Western territories, and will have territories every day, until now. I mean, so every intervening day, it's always states and territories. But at first, that's not a hidden kind of thing about the United States. People are very aware of it. The Civil War has a lot to do with the battle for slavery in the territories. Candidates for president will talk about their sort of, log cabin, backcountry roots. I think the moment when the imperial architecture of the United States becomes the kind of thing that has to be hidden is when those territories are no longer receptacles for the filling up with white settlers, when they become large populous places full of people who are perceived from the perspective of the mainland as non-white and who can't just be dislodged by white settlers. And so we're talking here about territories like Puerto Rico, Hawaii, the Philippines, Alaska, Guam, and that kind of imperialism, the kind about ruling distant populations, the kind that Britain does so proudly, that's the kind that the United States never sort of, or very rarely trumpets proudly, and for most of its history experiences a sort of cognitive dissonance about, on the one hand, it has a vision of itself as, a republic where everyone has sort of some say in the government. On the other hand, the reality is that, millions of people live under this different kind of government, and that never quite fits in the same way that it fits easily into British political culture.
Is that what it is? It's because that reality butts up against the I guess the narrative of the character of America, of the idea of America, and is it that, and or is it also that this is about resource extraction or about some type of we need a base here?
Well, yeah, it's interesting that the story of the United States' overseas colonies is not largely a story of successful resource extraction. There are sugar plantations and pineapple plantations and such, but it's not like the United States depends for its absolute livelihood on its overseas territories. It does, in the later 20th century, start to care a lot about, all of its military bases all over the planet. But why does it have large colonies? It doesn't really turn out to need them in some deep way. Nevertheless, there's a real contradiction between how the United States, which was born of an anti-colonial revolt, envisions itself, the kind of pattern that it had been in the 19th century, where it did, states and territories, but it always, or it intended to upgrade those territories to states once they were filled with large white populations, and then the kind of pattern that it acts out in the overseas territories, which doesn't quite fit that model, and therefore can't be part of the sort of or doesn't turn out to be part of the national myths of the country.
I want to start going through the history, but I'm sort of hung up on so why was there so much of this? What did we?
Well, so much of what?
Of maintenance of territories when we don't need the resources. Was it we need the markets? Was it the? I mean, because I know we have some dynamics where it's it gives us a little it's almost like Guantanamo Bay on some level. That is a little bit extreme, but that's a model of what we use these territories for. It's outside of the purview of the United States, but we still have control, so we can experiment with some stuff and maybe do stuff that's quasi-legal, that type of thing.
Well, so Guantanamo Bay is a pretty good example of this because, now we think of Guantanamo Bay as for the perspective of, the United States and the national security apparatus, it has been a very useful space. It's this little part of Cuba that the United States has exclusive jurisdiction over, and jurisdiction that is so complete it's as if it were a sovereign, but it's not a sovereign. And that difference between not quite technically being a sovereign is what allows all kinds of legal things to happen, or things that would be illegal if they were happening on U.S. soil. So you think of that as a very useful kind of space, but you have to realize that the United States had Guantanamo Bay since the very early 20th century. And, sometimes it had been genuinely really useful. Other times it had been a little less so. And there's a kind of history of experimentation. What can be done with it? Haitians who are, coming to the U.S. mainland can be detained there. That's something that happens before it gets its present-day use. And I think a lot of the history of the U.S. colonial empire, as opposed to the history of the pointillist empire and the military bases, is a history of speculative desires. But desires that don't always pan out. So there's this great enthusiasm at the end of the 19th century for the United States becoming a big colonial empire, for it having Hawaii and the Philippines, and these will be, highways to Asia and to trade with Japan and China. And that trade doesn't really become a huge thing. But nevertheless, in the same way that you can, a couple can fall out of love but stay married, a country can grow less imperialist or sort of lose its initial imperialist desire and remain an empire. And I think that's the history of the U.S. colonies, at least in the early 20th century. They do have some kinds of uses for Washington, but they are not the most useful parts of the country. Nevertheless, they're still part of it, and a part of the country that is neglected, that lives in the shadows. Well, that could be a very weird part of the country to occupy.
Tell us a little bit how, like, the Guano Islands fall into that, and that notion of appertaining, which I found fascinating.
Yeah. So what happens is there's an agricultural crisis in the United States in the mid-19th century, and the reason it's happening is kind of fairly predictable. Is that if you grow food on a farm, again, you grow a cash crop, so it could be grain, it could be cotton, it could be tobacco, but if you grow it again and again on the same plot of land and you keep selling it somewhere else rather than consuming it nearby or consuming it on the land and then depositing the nutrients back in the lands through feces or just by putting the waste back on the lands, you end up depleting the soil. And particularly, you start running down the soil's nitrates, which are kind of hard to restore if you just keep, doing that year after year. So farmers get really nervous about finding some way to replenish their parched farms, and the thing that does it is guano, which is, but guano can mean bird or bat feces used for fertilizer, but it turns out that this is the droppings of seabirds on these small dry islands that don't see a lot of rain, where the birds just land and they eat their anchovies and they land on the islands and then they defecate on the islands, and then it just just keeps piling up for years, centuries, millennia, drying in the sun. That stuff is a really useful fertilizer. And so in the middle of the 19th century, this is actually the first U.S. overseas expansion, the United States lays claim to nearly 100 uninhabited guano islands and annexes them to the United States. And there's a Guano Island Act that's passed, and it says that these places will be, once they're sort of claimed and the claim is ratified, they'll be appertaining to the United States, which is a kind of a weird sort of language, but what it seems to say is that they're fully part of the United States. Now, that phrase, appertaining to the United States, that's the legal foundation for the United States' overseas empire. That's the first time that the United States had annexed overseas territory. And there's a Supreme Court case about whether appertaining really, does that mean that these places are really part of the United States or not? And the Supreme Court decides yes. So it's these are just 100 small uninhabited islands. They're quickly scraped free of guano, and then after that, they're not as useful anymore. But nevertheless, they are the actual legal foundations for a much larger populous empire. One that includes up to 19 million people by the eve of World War II.
It's an amazing metaphor that our entire empire, the project of the empire, is literally built on mountains of crap. But
yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, and I'll just say one other thing, because we talked about the ways in which these places can be useful and then not have an obvious use from the perspective of Washington, but sort of develop one a little later. Those guano islands, after the guano is scraped off of them, they sort of fall into disrepair or disuse. But then it turns out in the mid-20th century, for all of the reasons that they're interesting to birds as places to land, they're also really useful for places for airplanes to land. And then suddenly the guano islands become or at least some of them become absolutely essential to the U.S. military strategy. And it is with the guano islands that the United States fights World War II in the Pacific.
Interesting. And let's move to the early 1900s, when the Supreme Court does sort of make a distinction between incorporated and unincorporated territories. What were the implications of that, and how much staying power did that have?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting moment. So the United States has just acquired a number of populated territories. It's gutted Spain's empire in a war, and it's also taken Hawaii and American Samoa. And then there's this legal question of, well, what are these places? Are they part of the United States? And if so, how much are they part of the United States? Are people who live in them automatically citizens? There's a law. It's called the 14th Amendment that says if you're born in the United States, you're a U.S. citizen. Does that apply to Filipinos? Does the Bill of Rights apply to Filipinos? So the Supreme Court argues it, and it's a contested thing. It's a very public thing. These arguments, and ultimately, what the Supreme Court decides is that there is a distinction, and this is a novel distinction. It wasn't one that had been around before, but the Supreme Court introduces it. There's a distinction between incorporated territories. Those territories are part of the United States in a constitutional sense. So those are the old Western territories, and they're also the two overseas territories that have the largest white populations, Hawaii, and the Supreme Court decides Alaska. But all of the territories that the United States had claimed from Spain, which is where most of its colonial subjects live, those, the Supreme Court decides, are unincorporated territories, which means that they are part of the United States, but they're not part of the United States that's covered by the Constitution. And so that's why, even today, you can be born in American Samoa. You're born in the United States. No one disputes that. You have a U.S. passport. The stars and stripes fly overhead. But nevertheless, your U.S. passport does not say you're a U.S. citizen because the 14th Amendment doesn't extend to you. You're a U.S. national instead.
I mean, to put it in context, this is the same Supreme Court that basically said literacy laws for voting were okay and poll taxes were okay. I mean, the agenda is pretty clear, right?
Yeah, and it's actually nearly identical to the court. I mean, there's, I think, one member different that decides the first of these cases. They're called the insular cases. That also decides Plessy v. Ferguson, which is the case that enshrines separate but equal as a constitutional way of running the country, which administratively divides the country into two in terms of white and non-white. The insular cases do something similar. They divide the country into two in terms of a constitutional zone and an extra-constitutional zone, and they also do it appealing to exactly the same logic. Who's really part of the country and who's, for racial reasons, not quite really part of the country. The difference is this. Plessy v. Ferguson, I mean, that's recognized today as one of the sort of worst mistakes in the court's history, and it's been overturned. The insular cases are still good law.
Yeah, well, I mean, Plessy v. Ferguson, we could be just a couple of years away from that type of regime returning in some respects. Maybe I'm overstating the case, maybe a little bit, but certainly the Lochner era may be back soon. But with that said, so this law, so how is it that? Well, I mean, I guess it's quite obvious why it's so durable, right? Is because why has that been so durable? I guess is really what I'm asking. Why? What were the forces that didn't allow Plessy v. Ferguson to stand, but allowed this to stand?
Yeah, I think one difference is that the Jim Crow was obviously a form of racist subordination, but it was also fairly public. It was hard to not know that the country had a Jim Crow system if you were living anywhere in the country in the 20th century. Nevertheless, it's been very easy not to really understand the colonial system or even the fact of overseas territories if you live in the mainland part of the United States or if you have lived there in the 20th and into the 21st century. So an example of this is even after Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico and, laid waste to the infrastructure of the island, there was and it made all the headlines, there was a national poll that asked people in the mainland, are Puerto Ricans U.S. citizens? And barely a majority of people, adults polled, were able to correctly say, yes, Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens. And if you asked adults under 30, only 37% of them were able to cough up that number. So I think one difference between the racist regime that had applied to African Americans is it was very much in the public view, whereas the colonial forms of subordination and segregation, those have kind of happened off stage, at least off stage from the perspective of the mainland.
Since we're talking about Puerto Rico, tell us the story of Cornelius Rhodes, because that is, we've talked on this program, that of the long history that the United States has had that in many respects is really one of, almost waging some type of war against Puerto Rico in one form or another. And Cornelius Rhodes, I think, sort of exemplifies that a little bit.
Yeah, so I said that the overseas parts of the United States are often off stage from the perspective of the mainland. And what's important to grasp is that all kinds of things can happen off stage that couldn't happen under the glare of the spotlights. And the Cornelius Rhodes story is a great example of that. So Cornelius Rhodes is a doctor. He's Harvard trained. He's from the mainland, but he goes to San Juan. He goes to Puerto Rico, and he goes there to study anemia, a condition from which many Puerto Ricans suffer. And so what does he do? Well, suddenly, when he hits the island, he just becomes a very different kind of doctor. So first of all, he intentionally refuses treatment to some of his patients just to see what will happen. He tries to induce disease in other of his patients also to see what will happen. He describes patients such as this to his colleagues as experimental animals. And then he writes a letter. He writes one of the most extraordinary letters that I've read as a historian, where he writes to a colleague, to a Boston colleague, and he starts off, it's a very chatty letter, and he said, how are you? Hope everyone's well. Here's some gossip about the field. And then he says, oh, and me, Puerto Rico, I'm in Puerto Rico. It's beautiful. The island is great. The only problem is the Puerto Ricans. They're awful. They're filthy. They steal. Frankly, they're the worst. And the best thing for Puerto Rico, he goes on to say, would be a total extermination of the population. And then he says, in fact, I've started it. I have killed 8 of my patients, and I've tried to transplant cancer. Turns out it's very hard to transplant cancer, but he doesn't know that. I've tried to transplant cancer into 13 others. Hope your wife's well, all best. And it's an incredible letter, right? Because he just it seems like he's confessed to murdering 8 people. And extraordinarily, the letter gets found by the Puerto Rican hospital staff, and it becomes a major scandal in Puerto Rico. Of course it does. There's an investigation by the government. That investigation uncovers yet another letter, which the governor describes as worse than the first, which is kind of impossible to imagine for me. But nevertheless, the government destroys that second letter, so we've never seen it as historians, and concludes that he wasn't really serious about what he said. He didn't really kill 8 people. And extraordinarily, Cornelius Rhodes is able to just leave. He doesn't face any kind of trial. He doesn't even lose his job. He just goes back to the mainland. What happens in San Juan stays in San Juan. And then his medical career takes off. Now, it does. I mean, what's amazing about the story is that in itself would be incredible, but it doesn't end because as his medical career takes off, he becomes the vice president of the New York Academy of Medicine. He goes into the Army, and while he's in the Army, he oversees he's the chief medical officer in a large-scale series of tests of chemical weapons on U.S. service members. So U.S. service members have toxic agents applied to their skin to see what happens. Many of them suffer permanent damage. They're put in gas chambers with gas masks to see what will happen. Some of them are put out in jungles and told to fight while they're gassed from overhead. A lot of those people are also Puerto Rican. And Cornelius Rhodes is right there in the middle of it, writing up reports. Does black skin blister differently than white skin? Cornelius Rhodes will let you know. He gets a medal for this. And then as a result of those experiments, one of the things they figure out is that some of these toxic agents are actually good at fighting cancer, and Cornelius Rhodes uses that to become, in the third phase of his career, the first head of the Sloan Kettering Institute, and basically one of the pioneers of chemotherapy. And that's what he's remembered for decades on the U.S. mainland, as a medical hero, the father of chemotherapy. And it really takes an extraordinarily long time before Puerto Ricans are able to get the message out that this guy who's been on the cover of Time magazine as a hero is actually the sort of like Mengele of Puerto Rico. And I mean, for me, that's kind of that's the final extraordinary bit, is that the informational segregation is so tight that it takes decades for Puerto Ricans to effectively, do something about the fact that Cornelius Rhodes is being openly celebrated as a hero on the mainland, and the people who are celebrating him have no idea what he was up to in Puerto Rico.
That story is just so nuts, man. But it
really is.
It does capture. I mean, it's almost the perfect metaphor in some respects, right? I mean, that is the extraction or the oppression ends up, fueling on some level at different times the expansion and the success of the country in some fashion. And then, we don't have too much time left here, but the nature of the empire changes to being less colonial and in many respects more like would you call it? Sort of via influence, or I mean, maybe the Hoover screws story sort of is a good metaphor for this.
Yeah, so I think there are two things that happen. As the United States, gets through World War II, it becomes the most powerful country in the world. And it has the option militarily. I mean, it physically can do this. It has the option of doing what Britain had done, which is expressing its power by taking a lot of colonies and controlling a lot of the land of the planet. Right at the end of World War II, the United States actually has, in occupied zones mainly, and colonies, which is a slightly lesser number, it has more people who are under U.S. jurisdiction, who are living outside of the mainland than who are living in all of the states. I mean, that's how much land the United States briefly controls at the end of World War II. And so then it faces an interesting question. Is it want to be Britain again? Does it want to sort of do that whole thing and claim colonies and annex Japan and all that kind of stuff? And it doesn't. It still has a colonial empire. There are still 5 inhabited territories of the United States today, and millions of people live in them. But nevertheless, the United States sort of pivots away. One thing it does is it seeks to find ways to influence outside of its borders, to extend its and project power, not by extending its borders, by annexing new places, but by controlling processes in foreign countries. But undergirding that, and this is what I focus on particularly, is that the United States does this not by abjuring territory entirely, but by claiming just a bunch of small territorial points. And by a bunch, I mean literally hundreds. That's the number of foreign military bases that the United States has. But these points act as sort of staging grounds and beacons and just little sort of connectors that allow the United States to spread a much more diffuse influence out throughout the world, which is still undergirded by some sort of territorial component, but a territorial footprint that I think looks more pointillist than colonial.
I mean, it's almost like the web, like a series of servers. We have something like nearly 800 bases across the country. I mean, across the world.
Yeah, it's a network,
right? How does that? Is the influence there exclusively? Is it projecting power from a military standpoint? Like these are, we have the high ground in these 800 places, or we have control of, it need be, the harbor, or is it also a cultural one too?
Yes, what I think is so interesting about the bases is that their purpose is military. That's what they're there for. That's why we call them military bases. But that's not all they do, because you have to imagine these places as little, or in some cases actually not so little, enclaves that are full of people from the United States. And there's all kind of interesting contacts between people on the base, often who have quite a lot of money compared to the surrounding region, and the people around it. So in the book, I tell a story about the complicated interactions that people who are on base have with folks who are living in the shadow of the bases. And it actually becomes a really important vector for the spread of U.S. culture. So one of the questions I take up in my book is, why does Liverpool become this sort of world city of pop? Like, why is there so much? We know about the Beatles, but, you know, the bench is like 500 bands deep. There's a lot of, you know, bands that like were pointed in the direction of the Beatles. You know, we're doing that kind of music, and they're all coming out of the Liverpool area. And why is that? Because Liverpool hadn't habitually been the major city for pop music in Britain. And the answer is that, you know, Liverpool is in the shadow of the single largest U.S. Air Force base in Europe, this base called Burtonwood. And it's really clear that not just the Beatles, but all these other bands are kind of subsisting on, I mean, you know, these guys in the base who are very rich, who are going out into the clubs at night, who are demanding U.S.-style rock, and, you know, Ringo's stepdad works on the bass, makes his money there, and gets all these records as a result of working there that he gives to Ringo. John's mom is what's called a good time girl, so I imagine she's spending some time with the guys from the basses. She also has an incredibly up-to-date record collection, and that's how Paul gets his records too. And George sort of steals them from the local record shop, which is also bristling with all kinds of like really good, what they then called race records, which are African American records of African American music, and all of that's coming from the portal of the base, where there's just all this money, there's all this glamour, and there are all these guys sort of, you know, waiting to spread it around for willing young teenagers who can play U.S.-style rock. So it's not entirely a surprise that the Liverpool area becomes an area sort of where rock takes off, because these bases are, you know, in some ways little just portals of the United States, and little portals not just of U.S. military power, but of U.S. You know, industrial standards and culture and all, you know, language and all these other things that come with the United States that seep through the portal as well.
Well, it's fascinating stuff. I wish we had more time to get to the standardization of screws, which I found fascinating. And longtime listeners of this program will remember the story of the Northern Mariana Islands and Jack Abramoff and Tom DeLay, and how they would visit that in the mid-aughts as a way of basically getting made in USA goods by basically near slave labor, practically. But there's a lot more in here. How to Hide an Empire, A History of the Greater United States. Daniel Immerwahr, thank you so much for your time today. We will put a link at majority.fm of your book.
Thanks so much. It's been a pleasure to be on.
All right, folks. We got to take a break, head into the fun half of the program, wherein we will have more fun. More fun than we really should be allowed to have. A close-up video of Seb Gorka talking to Michelle Bachmann. That's always fun. Also,
we have Ro Khanna fighting a coup.
Oh, is it? We do?
Some new sound coming.
Okay, great. We have, Joe Biden talking about his new slogan. We have I don't know. I don't know if this is an interesting sort of misreporting on both Biden's support with minority voters and really sort of gender splits in donations coming from MSNBC. And, of course, Stephen Moore's last-ditch effort to argue that he is better than Herman Cain. All this and more.
Just overwhelmed by the ideas.
Yeah, can we play that drop? Just because we've contemplated one day coming into work and just instead of actually doing a show, just play this one clip from Dave Rubin over and over again.
I have to say that my brain is still in recovery mode from taking in so many high-level important ideas. I have to say that my brain is still in recovery mode from taking in so many high-level important ideas. I have to say that my brain is still in recovery mode from taking in so many high-level important ideas. I have to say that my brain is still in recovery mode from taking in so many high-level important ideas. I have to say that my brain is still in recovery mode from taking in so many high-level important ideas. I have to say that my brain is still in
There you go.
Same.
I'm starting to, you know what?
It's almost better, though, when you can see his face, though, because he is saying this without any sense of, like, this is a weird thing to say.
Oh, he's taking it in.
He's
literally taking in so many
that was prompted by a conversation he listened to between the Weinstein brothers. So,
how many times has he had the Weinstein brothers on?
Literally something like,
how many times has he had those?
Like
these two guys who no one's ever heard of, like the greatest thinkers in the history of the world.
I don't know. Let me search my Rubin Report podcast feed.
Dave Rubin's gay. No, my mind's blown by so many high-level ideas.
Folks, just a reminder, you can support this program by becoming a member by going to jointhemajorityreport.com. Jointhemajorityreport.com. And when you do, not only do you support the daily free show, but you also get extra content virtually every single day. You make this show possible. So if you've been thinking about joining, please do. And of course, if you do not have the financial means, but you want access to the fun half, send us an email at majorityreporters@gmail.com. Wait an inordinately long period of time for us to go through the emails. It takes us a long time. But we will get there, and we will work out a deal for you, I promise. Also, justcoffee.coop, fair trade coffee, tea, or chocolate. Use the coupon code MAJORITY. Get 10% off. Today is Tuesday. On Tuesdays, what happens is day turns into night, and then in Tuesday nights...
And then high-level ideas.
High-level ideas happen when your brain has recovered.
My brain has to recover from the Majority Report. Sorry, I can't take it. Tonight, Dr. Maytha Al-Hassan, we're talking about the uprisings in Algeria and the Sudan through the lens of Malcolm X and his relation to Africa, the Middle East, and liberation. Anna Kasparian is coming in studio, and we are going to dunk on Joe Biden and Pete Buttigieg. Lula de Silva did a really important interview. We're going to talk about that, and, of course, the coup in Venezuela. So a ton of stuff tonight. And at 6 o'clock, as if that wasn't enough, a special live stream on the Spanish election results with Nando Vila on the Michael Brooks Show YouTube channel. So 6 and 7, Michael Brooks Show YouTube channel, patreon.com/TMBS for the whole thing this weekend, an illicit history of humanitarian law.
Jamie, the Intifada?
This week on the Intifada, we have released the very first edition of a new side project called Prolet Cult that AP Andy is doing for our patrons. It's about UFOs, conspiracy theories, space news, and the paranormal, but from a Marxist perspective. So check that out if you're a patron, or this might be a good time to join. Also, Sean spoke with a guy from Means TV over the weekend. That's going to be out in our free episode later this week. And we still have our episode from last week where we talked to George Chicarello Mar about the coup in Venezuela, which seems very relevant in light of the news coming out of Venezuela now, and lots of other luminaries of the left. So check it out.
Matt?
On YouTube, episode 20 of Literary Hangover, Looking Back on the Spanish War, essay by George Orwell, is available. For patrons, there's another essay on the same topic by the same guy. It's called Spilling the Spanish Beans by George Orwell when he was fresh from the Spanish Civil War, healing from his throat wound, and he was pissed off that he was called a Trotsky fascist in Spain, and he sort of explains what that's about.
Lots of ideas.
There's too many ideas in Spain.
Too many ideas. There's a lot of ideas in Spain, so it's kind of hard to keep track here of all the ideas. I don't know enough about Franco, but I do know that he's really into markets.
Getting the SJWs out of the schools.
Literally getting the SJWs out of the schools. What are your thoughts on Spanish leader Franco? I don't know. There's a lot coming at me
Andreas
right now.
Nin and Trotsky. What was the deal with those two guys?
All right, we'll see you in the fun half, 646-257-3920. Sam Seder on the Majority Report. So this morning, apparently, according to the Washington Post, at about 10 a.m., Guaido went to the Plaza Altamira, surrounded by soldiers. He led supporters in singing the Venezuelan national anthem. By late morning, around 5,000 people had arrived, some chanting, "Yes, we can." And according to the Washington Post, a dozen soldiers were present. I feel like you're going to need more if you're going to stage a coup.
Were they like the A-team of Venezuela?
Yeah, a dozen soldiers seems like not enough. And then Vice President Pence of this country took to Twitter to support the coup, and Ro Khanna was on MSNBC taking some issue with, frankly, the idea that the Vice President of the United States would be actively cheering on I guess, presumably a military coup. But, I mean, with a dozen soldiers, I just don't think you're going to cut it.
I think they had more at the Bay of Pigs.
What you're seeing and what the U.S. government's role should be going forward now, given this.
Well, this is why some of us in Congress have been urging restraint. We condemn Maduro's regime. It's been a failed regime, but we have been saying that the vice president shouldn't be interfering and inciting violence with Guaido. What we should be doing is deferring to the Pope to have a negotiated settlement, or Uruguay or Mexico. And it looks like the United States is inching into yet another bloody conflict, and this is not going to be easy. Venezuela is one of the most armed nations in in the world, 1.6 million militias. The military appears divided between Guaido and Maduro. And the question is this really the United States' role to get involved in yet another war overseas?
I mean, it's unclear, what this is. It feels like they're trying to jumpstart a process that didn't seem to be going anywhere, because all the chips seem to have settled, and nothing was happening in terms of Guaido's attempt to take power in Venezuela. So we shall see. Hopefully, this time tomorrow, we won't be talking about U.S. military intervention in any fashion.
I think 100 Russians on the ground helps that not happen.
It's not like inconceivable, right? I mean, it just, who knows? But it would be obviously highly problematic.
I think the coup's going to fail.
Well, it sort of feels like this is there's some desperation. Like,
they don't have an ability to understand that there is both for, realpolitik reasons, which is that the military is totally embedded in this government in ways that make it very resilient, and there's also organic support for this government, period. And no matter how much they repeat otherwise, it's just belied by the facts. In some ways, it's stunning how resilient the support is, given some of the serious mistakes that have been made,
right,
and the massive imperial pressure from the United States.
However, the only mitigating factor apparently is that Eric Prince, I don't know what his company is now. Is it Jay or formerly Blackwater? Is basically pitching to the U.S. government mercenaries. Pay for some mercenaries to go down there. We'll wrap this thing up. That should work out well.
Great track record there.
Yeah, exactly. Let's go to the phones. You calling from a 478 area code. Who's this? Where are you calling from?
Well, I do think this is Jeff from Georgia saying. How you doing?
Jeff from Georgia. How are you, sir?
Hey, man, I'm doing great, especially since the whole Georgia Report crew is back. I just want to say thank you so much for all y'all do. I know you had a bunch of pre-recorded shows, but, man, it just ain't the same without your live voice tingling into my Southern-style ears, Sam.
I understand. Believe me, I understand.
Just real quick, I don't know if y'all know this. I was actually born in Guam. My dad worked for old Uncle Sam's Air Force, so that's what he was doing over there. I ain't been back since I was but a little bitty baby. But a little bit of what I do know about Guam is that despite being one of our more prosperous colonies in terms of per capita income, it has a ton of problems that are really the direct result of the two largest industries being the military and tourism there. And it's really made an environmental mess of the whole island. Crazy things happen, like I was told, like when it rains, there are so many toads that would flood the roads that you literally couldn't drive on them because there were so many frog guts everywhere.
Yeah, that's like one of the 10 plagues.
Yeah, exactly. It's fucking insane. And like I said, it's my understanding that Guam is actually one of our more prosperous colonies.
Right.
And there are severe problems between, the servicemen and women and their spouses and families who live there, and their standard of living, which is, mostly good, if a little bit strange because you're kind of so far away from everything in a way, especially in terms of America. But for the indigenous people, the Chamorro is what they're called, who live there. It's really it's never been good. It hasn't been good, honestly, since the 40s probably when the Japanese took over the island. I don't really have a larger point to any of all that except to let people know that this is still a going concern. I'm not an old man. I was born in 1985. And Guam is still around, and Guam still has a lot of the same problems that it did when I was but a little boy.
Well, Interesting. I had no idea, but I'm not surprised. My only experience with Guam was that the original Air America founder, I think, was arrested on Guam in some type of.
That's cool.
Some type of.
Sounds like a cool ass dude. That's
yeah,
what
I know. He definitely was making use of the expansive territories of the United States. That's for sure.
It's what it's there for.
Jeff, I appreciate the call.
I appreciate y'all.
Thanks.
Have a good week now.
So Donald Trump's still looking for someone to put on the Federal Reserve, and Stephen Moore, despite the fact that he on national television said, hey, I got a pretty big learning curve for this, a little steep, but I can handle it, and I desperately need a job. Probably not one of the guys that you want to be overseeing the monetary policy of the country, but he's still making his case. He's better than Herman Cain.
Well, but part of what some of the things you're writing show are, to some observers, saying it shows that you're not qualified because of your views on gender, including things like pay equity. I want to point out something you wrote in a 2014 column. You actually asked, what are the implications of a society in which women earn more than men? We don't really know, but it could be disruptive to family stability. A lot of people look at it and say, what do you mean by that?
I just want to make it clear. He wrote this in 2014. Not 1914. 2014. We don't know what could happen if women actually start making. This is basically a movement to put an incel on the Federal Reserve.
Is this Jordan Peterson?
Right. Here we go.
A lot of people look at it and said, what do you mean by that?
Well, look, first of all, when you look at what's happened under Donald Trump and what's happening with wages now and increases in income, I think prosperity and economic growth are a women's issue. They benefit, blacks. They benefit minorities. This is, as you just said, this is a sizzling economy right now. I'm very proud to have played a role in this. I was the senior economic advisor with Larry Kudlow to that campaign. It's a really, really strong economy. Women have benefited. George, we have the lowest.
Let me just interrupt you right there.
We have the lowest unemployment rate for women in 50 years.
But right there in that
that's
article,
a big deal.
In that article, you're taking on legislation designed to close the wage gap.
We are closing the wage gap. I mean, the way to close the wage gap is by creating a healthy economy. Right now, we have 7.1 million more jobs than people that are filling them right now. That's allowing women, minorities, others to increase their wages. I mean, look, I'm happy and proud of the fact that I played a small role in creating an economy today that's probably as good as it's been in 20 years. In terms of the labor force issues right now, George, this is the best labor market for workers in your and my lifetime. I mean, look, I'm not going to apologize for that. I think it's a fantastic thing. I just want when it comes to wages and gender equity, I want that to be decided by the market. I don't want government to intervene in those kinds of.
I mean, do we have more of this? What does Stephanopoulos do after this? Like, he's just sat there as Moore is specifically not answering his question and just going on and on in a desperate attempt to ingratiate himself with Donald Trump so he gets appointed to the Fed. I mean, this is one of the most naked.
Well, we'll have to leave it there. We have to have Meghan McCain on to incite against Ilhan Omar.
Does Stephanopoulos follow this up by going, like, listen, first off, I want to apologize for asking you to apologize for all the success that you've had. I really apologize for that.
Women have benefited. George,
let me just interrupt you right there.
We have the lowest unemployment rate for women in 50 years.
But right there in that article,
a big deal.
In that article, you're taking on legislation designed to close the wage gap.
Keep going a little further.
And as good as it's been in 20 years. In terms of the labor force issues right now, George, this is the best labor market for workers in your and my lifetime. I mean, look, I'm not going to apologize for gender equity. I want that to be decided by the market. I don't want government to intervene in those kinds of things.
Your fate is in the hands of the Senate, including some female senators, Senator Susan Collins.
What is going, like, is he like contractually obligated to not make his subjects answer the question? I mean, it's almost it's bizarre.
Asking follow-up
It's like a
questions is
total
poor form.
gaslight. Like, wait a second. Are we supposed to believe that he answered that question? It doesn't matter. It really is stunning. I mean, I just don't understand. Like, surely Stephanopoulos was aware that he's not answering the question. He's just decided, like, well, I did the whole thing where you ask twice. If you don't get the answer, you just move on.
He could at least register that he did not answer the question.
Right. Right. Just so that my audience doesn't think they're completely insane, I'm not going to pretend like you answered the question. You clearly don't want to answer all of what you just said. There's no reason to believe that if you think it will destabilize the family unit if women make more because of legislation than you would if they just, based on the amazing success of Donald Trump. But they don't need to address that. And he did good. I liked him. He praised me, and better than Herman Cain. Better than Herman Cain.
He also thinks that it wants to see kids 11 and 12 working. He's a kind of a radical on that sort of thing.
I'm sure he was really in the fields.
I wonder
I'm sure
what,
he was in the fields when he was growing up.
I wonder what that would do for our social systems if we reintroduced child sweatshop labor.
Even more stability.
Yeah,
right.
You don't want to deny those kids the chance to succeed.
That's right. So Joe Biden is on the trail. Apparently, Joe Biden's the only person who's talking about Donald Trump. Although, I think certainly
Bernie's been talking
about him quite a bit. I'm sure all the other candidates, but only Joe Biden, according to the news, is talking about Donald Trump. I'm not sure what that's about. But here he is, Joe Biden, with his slogan, which I actually think, do we determine whether or not this was specifically the actual slogan that George W. Bush used to run against Al Gore, making United States moral again?
His was restoring honor and dignity to the White House,
Okay,
but
there you
it's an absolute repeat.
It's
no doubt.
basically the same thing here.
The president has a motto, make America great again. Do you have one?
Make America moral again. Make America return to the essence of who we are, the dignity of the country, the dignity of people, treating our people with dignity, and this god-awful deliberate division that's being taken in order to separating people to aggrandize his own power.
Make America return to the essence of who we are would be Martua.
Martua. Biden also came out yesterday, said he is not for. I mean, so we've heard what Joe Biden's campaign is based upon. It's to make America moral again, to return it to its essence, et cetera, et cetera. He also, when Joe Biden got specific, he said he is not for Medicare for all.
It's not moral.
And, well, all right, here's the question. Joe Biden wants to make America moral again, and he will not support the idea of healthcare as a human right in this country. A public option in a marketplace of private competitors available only for 10 million Americans is not perceiving healthcare as a human right. Ady Barkan, an activist, healthcare activist, who was really bad. I mean, I think maybe people recall that at one point he was on a flight, and he has, is it ALS? That has been slowly, basically eating away at his ability to speak, walk, etc. And I think it was only maybe it was less than 2 years ago when he was on a flight. I think it was with Ted Cruz. I mean, that's how he sort of got on the national scene. And he recorded an exchange, I think it was with Ted Cruz, but I can't remember, where he was basically saying, how can you cut the Affordable Care Act we need to expand health care. Well, he was at a hearing yesterday. Was it today or yesterday? Today's hearing this morning. It's a Medicare for All hearing. He is using a device which basically tracks his eye movements, I believe, that allows him to type into a computer and then it generates a voice. So let's hear that testimony.
3 years ago, Rachel and I felt like we had reached the mountaintop. We had fulfilling careers, a wonderful community of friends and family, and a smiling, chubby infant boy. We could see decades of happiness stretching out before us. The sun was shining and there was not a cloud in sight. And then, out of the clear blue sky, we were struck by lightning. ALS. A mysterious neurological disease with no cure and no good treatment. A life expectancy of 3 to 4 years. Most of its victims are in their 50s and 60s. I was 32. Every month since my diagnosis, my motor neurons have died out, my muscles have disintegrated, and I have become increasingly paralyzed. I am speaking to you through this computer because my diaphragm and tongue are simply not up to the task. Although my story is tragic, it is not unique. Indeed, in many ways, it is not so rare. Jennifer Epps Addison, the president of my organization, is sitting next to me. Like me, her husband was struck at a young age by a neurological disease. Multiple sclerosis. 10% of Americans have a serious disability. Every family is eventually confronted with serious illness or accidents. On the day we are born and on the day we die, and on so many days in between, all of us need medical care. And yet in this country, the wealthiest in the history of human civilization, we do not have an effective or fair or rational system for delivering that care. I will not belabor the point, because you and your constituents are well aware of the problems: high costs, bad outcomes, mind-boggling bureaucracy, racial disparities, bankruptcies, geographic inequities, and obscene profiteering. The ugly truth is this: health care is not treated as a human right in the United States of America. This fact is outrageous. And it is far past time that we change it. Say it loud for the people in the back: health care is a human right.
I mean, it is sort of shocking to me that Joe Biden would come out with his proposal. I think it was yesterday, in the context of this. But this is, the angle that he is riding, I don't know. It's going to be fascinating. I mean, obviously, look, I think if we were to do a poll of the audience of this program, I would imagine that Joe, of all the candidates, and I think there's a fairly wide disparity of support for different candidates in our audience. Joe Biden, I would imagine, would be near the bottom, certainly in the bottom half, I would say, of the distribution of what people in this audience would want. For the most part. Obviously, there's some people who do. But it's going to be fascinating to see how much of what Joe Biden's actual record has been gets disseminated to the broad Democratic base. I mean, look, there was, I think, a real understanding, a real sense. Maybe this is a slight exaggeration. But in 2008, when Joe Biden was picked, I think there was a real sense that people had it like Joe Biden's never going to be president. He's going to be, past the age in which we generally elect presidents. And I think over the course of those 8 years, in part because Donald Trump won at age 70, in part because Bernie Sanders, ran a vibrant campaign as someone who was going to be older, and people wanted Sanders and Warren. Joe Biden's in play, but his record, really, I would say, I mean, of all the Democrats in the race, I mean, there's a couple, you know, like, I don't know, ones who may not make it through the debate, or, you know, Klobuchar, but, you know, but his record is not good.
Well, and frankly,
I mean, even in the context of contemporaneous with his sort of heyday, he was in the more conservative part of the Democratic Party. And now it really is, I mean, he's anachronistic. And it's going to be interesting to see if he can maintain this support that comes with being Barack Obama's VP, which is really what it is. It's really going to be a function of just how much of Joe Biden's record is going to be sort of more, the awareness of his record is going to permeate the Democratic voter. We'll see.
It's going to be fun to watch Bernie and Warren smack him around, though. Like, she came out strong on the first day that he announced, because she's been dealing with him for years because she took on the credit card companies, and he was, you know, pro credit card company.
That's absolutely right. and Joe Biden has basically is out there today or yesterday, I guess in his announcement yesterday in Pittsburgh, calling himself a union man 4 days after having a fundraiser with one of his top sort of bundlers, who is a partner in a law firm that is an anti-union law firm, who when he announced this, he was talking to a bunch of guys from the AFL-CIO, a bunch of guys and a bunch of women, I guess. And they are all dealing with massive pension cuts that was a function of an Obama-era law that was the Multi-Employer Pension Reform Act of 2014. And it was also a bill that rolled back some of the Dodd-Frank consumer protection regulations. Yeah, because sometimes you can get too much of that. It also lifted limits on campaign contributions to national political parties. The measure allows sponsors of pension plans who can demonstrate they're in declining or critical financial condition to cut promised worker benefits in order to remain solvent. Members of Teamsters Local 249, who Biden spoke to, are facing up to 30% reductions in their retirement benefits. So here is Bernie on Anderson Cooper, arguing that Joe Biden's proclamations of being a union man need to be taken with a rather large grain of salt. Maybe actually close to a salt lick.
Obviously, critical organized labor is critical support in a Democratic primary. Are you concerned that Biden can make inroads there, that Biden has a leg up there?
Well, look, I'm running against, I think, 19 other people, so I'm concerned about everybody. But I think when people take a look at my record versus Vice President Biden's record, I helped lead the fight against NAFTA. He voted for NAFTA. I helped lead the fight against PNTR with China. He voted for it. I strongly oppose the Trans-Pacific Partnership. He supported it. I voted against the war in Iraq. He voted for it. So I think what I hope, Anderson, what this campaign is about, and I got to tell you, Joe Biden, Joe is a friend of mine, but I think what we need to do with all of the candidates, have a issue-oriented campaign, not personal attacks, but talk about what we have done in our political lives, what we want to do as president, and how we're going to transform our economy so that it works for all of us and not just the 1%.
I mean, in many respects, it's going to come down, and this is going to be this will be the final chapter of my Blame the Electorate book. It's going to be a function of just like how, deep is our voters digging into on issues that they care for. I mean, obviously, Joe Biden, by saying I'm a union man, is going after the same people that, Bernie Sanders is. The question is, how deep are those voters going to look into their accomplishments? And it's, it's across the board. I mean, it's, how, Pete Buttigieg or Beto O'Rourke can say, he's a champion of immigrants, but it's really, you got to dig a little deeper to see, what has he actually done in terms of protecting folks.
I think that trade is a really good area to focus on, because I think that my sense, not just of polling, but those trade agreements, there's a very big sense of the direct relationship between those agreements and the harm that people have felt, particularly in the demographic that they're both talking to in those clips. And I think some of the issues with Biden are huge, and he should be relentlessly hit for things like the bankruptcy bill, obviously. But I think the trade agreements are very much like in the DNA and the lived experience of those places. And I think that it's a great place to hit them on hard.
It's also like, what issues do people actually care about? Because, okay, in the primary, I think it will be a big liability that Biden has been on the wrong side of things like busing, minority rights, women's rights, like all of that stuff. And he has not been a real progressive. In the general election, we're going to see them making two different kinds of appeals to the swing voters, because there are swing voters who voted for Trump last time around because they are socially conservative. Maybe they're racist, maybe they're sexist, all of that stuff. And there are swing voters who went for Trump's economic populism. And we're going to find out which one of those has more pull. Not to mention all the people who don't normally vote, which are obviously going to be more towards Bernie because they skew very poor.
Well, we're going to see who drives that in the primary. It's going to be interesting to see. And frankly, in terms of people's motivation in terms of policy, seeing Warren down where she is in terms of the polls is not encouraging in terms of what motivates people's votes.
I think that trade has an advantage in terms of it speaks to something beyond just policy. I think it speaks to like a kind of broader sense of what's happened to certain places in terms of geography and economics.
That's
in a
how
way
Trump
that's
used
sort
it.
of that's how Trump used it, and I think it kind of has the opportunity to bridge those things. Because obviously, I mean, for better or for worse, most people are not going to dig that deeply into policy, but they're going to get senses and sensibilities of things and instincts and arguments, and I think trade is a good bridge for that.
Meanwhile, to the extent that Democrats were not. It's sometimes just sort of stunning where you and this is also, I think, a problem not just with Democrats, although I think the relationship between Democrats and sort of the mainstream media is different from Republicans in the mainstream media. And the idea of impeachment, despite the fact the sort of the breadth and the depth of the corruption that is involved in the Trump administration has not gained any traction until the president starts violating process issues. Now, this is important because, again, we said this yesterday. If you do not hold the president to account in terms of its obligations and the executive branch to its obligations, to, responding to subpoenas from Congress, then really you have fundamentally undermined the checks and balances of our government. And right now, the Trump administration is suing different blanks to block House subpoenas for their records. And this stuff pertains to were there fraudulent loans that that Trump and his family members got from banks? Was there money laundering? Was there, and all of which is based in testimony. These are not fishing expeditions, right? I mean, these were testimony that they got from public testimony, from his consigliere. Here is Katie Porter on CNN explaining that the Trump administration wants it both ways.
It sounds like the president and his adult children and businesses say that you want too much. You want too much. You're going back too far. You're looking into too many personal details, and they are suing to block you from being able to see that.
I will tell you this. I am old enough to remember Whitewater, which was a real estate deal that took place like 15 years before the Clintons got into the White House, I think, maybe even before then. And then an investigation that lasted like 6 years. Jesus, it did. Yeah, it was nuts.
And culminated in a frigging impeachment process.
Over a lie that the president told in a deposition about what the definition of sex was.
I lied so many times and they got me on a technicality.
Too many personal details, and they are suing to block you from being able to see that.
Well, I support Chairwoman Waters doing her job on the Financial Services Committee. She's asking for these documents to fill in some of the gaps that are revealed in the Mueller report. And the president is not a private citizen. He has become a public figure by choosing to run for office. He gets public benefits like living in the White House and getting to fly on Air Force One. And with that comes disclosure of things that would otherwise be private. So I think the subpoenas are targeted, and I have great confidence in both our court system and these financial institutions to disclose the documents.
Here's what the Trump legal team says. The subpoenas issued to Deutsche Bank and Capital One by chairpersons Schiff and Waters are unlawful and illegitimate. They seek information going back decades from anyone with even a tangential connection to the president, including children, minors, and spouses. He was a private citizen. His children were private citizens then. So how do you respond specifically?
Incidentally, we should remind you that at least one of his children is a top advisor to the White House.
That's my adult child.
He negotiated the Moscow Tower for me.
So how do you respond specifically to those complaints?
When somebody runs for office and becomes elected, they have a duty to disclose and answer questions. The reason that we're asking for these documents is because they pertain to a pattern and practice of dealing with Deutsche Bank and Capital One. We didn't subpoena every business dealing that the president has ever had. These subpoenas were narrowly targeted, and I respect the president's desire to petition the courts for redress, but this is also a president who said he should enjoy special protection from the courts, and he should enjoy special protection from the president, for instance, from having to answer questions in person under oath during the Mueller investigation, and now he wants to have it the other way and be just a private citizen. So with public duties come public responsibilities, and I think that's what we're trying to do.
If you were tasked with creating the perfect spokesperson to go after Donald Trump on financial issues, what you would do was you would go into a laboratory and create Katie Porter. You would create someone with an incredible brain for this stuff.
Why? Because she's mean.
Very well spoken, and then make her look like she
woman.
came, like she just like walked out of a house in suburban Ohio, essentially.
She really does have like middle American decency on lock.
Strong mom energy.
Oh my God, it's crazy.
Like, it's not that I'm angry at you, Donald.
I'm just
disappointed.
very disappointed.
I'm disappointed that you're a deranged sociopath who's violating the Constitution, and I don't want to have to call for impeachment. That would never be my first choice, Donald.
It's sort of like, oh, look it, you didn't eat your carrot sticks. And also, your financial disclosure forms, Section 503C, are not compliant with what federal law statute is about loans.
You know what's funny is that she actually has very much the capacity to actually effectively go after Trump the way Clinton tried to. But she has that credibility.
Well, I mean, I don't think she's not going to make any type of moral case. It's the case
No,
that
no, I'm
she's
talking
making.
the more of the when she would say look at him, he's nuts. Like that sort of like I'm an adult in charge thing that didn't work as well. She does that very well against him.
Yeah, but she's not even addressing it. She's just like, talking about the actual specifics of what she's doing. I mean, that's what she's not, I respect his right to have redress in courts. That's fine. But,
I respect his adult children.
Yeah, exactly.
We all respect Donald Trump's adult children. The word is respect.
The large adult children.
The large adult children.
Speaking of...
And the small one, too.
Speaking of Katie...
No, we actually do respect that one.
Speaking of Katie Porter, one of the highlights of Katie Porter's brief tenure in Congress at this point was her questioning of Jamie Dimon, the CEO of J.P. Morgan, and Chase Bank. And let's check out what Chase is using its Twitter feed for these days. It is to admonish people for not saving in their bank.
It's to give them helpful advice.
Right. And here it is, the Chase tweet of the day. This is Monday's motivation coming to you on a Tuesday. Why is my balance so low? And the bank account speaks back to you. Make coffee at home. Eat the food that's already in the fridge. Bank account says, you don't need a cab. It's only 3 blocks. And then you say, I guess we'll never know. Bank account, seriously? That's why there's no money in that bank, because you haven't cut back on things. You splurge on your $3 coffee. You let the food go to waste.
Do you know the concept of the panopticon in Foucault? Like of this sort of like internal gaze of surveillance?
You can easily see all the cells basically from one central point.
Right.
There's this way in which it's like, not only is that disgusting and inappropriate, and we'll, explain all the ways that Chase benefits from public largesse, but like the way it taps into like a certain kind of like relentless self-criticism that people already subject themselves to, which they shouldn't in a time of absolutely scarce like the psychology of our time, that the response to record inequality and lack of opportunity and basic decency is like, well, you shouldn't splurge on a coffee.
We just didn't try hard enough. That's why people are poor.
And now your account has that same tone.
Did a couple of interviews in the past with ethnographers who have gone across the country looking at poverty and people who lost their homes in the financial crisis. And one of the things that was consistent was that they all thought it was because of personal choices that they made, and did not have the bird's eye view to see like there were major policies that left them in these type of situations. Now, Jamie Dimon, obviously doesn't work the Twitter feed for Chase Bank, but one way that Jamie Dimon, his bank could have responded would have been, why is my bank account so low? Chase, because you didn't get $3.7 billion in additional profit because of the tax cuts that Donald Trump, could you just imagine? Even if you were just you, and you got just, let's say, a quarter of that, less than $1 billion worth of benefit from Donald Trump, boy, you could take that cab. In fact, you could take that cab just across the street.
You could give me a $3 million bailout. I could make do with that.
Right.
And that's nothing.
Oh, yeah.
That's chump change. That's total bullshit.
1% of that, and you would be like, forget it. I'm going to buy a coffee every single day.
Boom.
Even if I don't drink coffee.
Just be pouring it out on the street.
But on top of that,
why are you pouring that coffee out? It's my bailout.
There's also other reasons, despite not getting a $3.7 billion windfall in the Trump tax cuts. And Katie Porter points those reasons out to Jamie Dimon just weeks ago, as the bank still sort of like contends that the reason why you don't have money is because you're not cutting back on things enough.
This woman had, and I apologize, you're going to need to follow orally. She had $2,425 a month. She rents a one-bedroom apartment. She and her daughter sleep together in the same room. In Irvine, California, that average one-bedroom apartment is going to be $1,600. She spends $100 on utilities. Take away the $1,700, and she has net $725. She's like me. She drives a 2008 minivan and has gas. $400 for car, expenses, and gas. Net $325. The Department of Agriculture says a low-cost food budget, that is ramen noodles, a low food budget is $400. That leaves her $77 in the red. She has a Cricket cell phone, the cheapest cell phone she can get for $40. She's in the red $117 a month. She has after-school childcare because the bank is open during normal business hours. That's $450 a month. That takes her down to negative $567 per month. My question for you, Mr. Diamond, is how should she manage this budget shortfall while she's working full-time at your bank?
I don't know that all your numbers are accurate. That number is generally a starter job.
She is a starting employee. She has a 6-year-old child. Okay, this is her first job.
And you can get those jobs out of high school, and she may have my job one day. So
she may, but Mr. Diamond, she doesn't have the ability right now to spend your $31 million.
I'm totally sympathetic.
She's short 567. What would you suggest she do?
I don't know. I'd have to think about that.
Would you recommend that she take out a JP Morgan Chase credit card and run a deficit?
I don't know. I'd have to think about it.
Would you recommend that she overdraft at your bank and be charged overdraft fees?
I don't know. I'd have to think about it.
So I know you have a lot
I'd love to call her up and have a conversation about her financial affairs and see if we can be helpful.
There's the genesis of the idea right here.
You know what he's going to say. You know what you got to do? Stop taking so many cabs. Have your coffee at home.
Clearly, he went home and he thought about it, and this is what he came up with.
Let me first ask you, you partial iced coffee? You drinking a lot of those? Does your kid need childcare?
And Chase then quickly apologizes. Our Monday motivation is to get better at Monday motivation tweets. Thanks for the feedback, Twitter world.
Wow. Have you tried being less poor?
Scene. Yes, there you go.
Can we get back to, like, every company has hired like a handful of agencies for the same, like, brand design and ad copy. So, like, can't we at least get back to, like, the Dick Cheney era of, like, I'm evil, fuck you. And we have to have, like, Chase being like, oh, sorry about that. We're just going to go back to totally pillaging the rest of the economy and destroying your life. Hashtag case of the Mondays.
Somebody may have reminded them that they got $25 billion worth of TARP bailout money, taxpayer money.
I would have liked to have a phone conversation with Jamie Dimon about how we could have avoided that.
For those of you who want to call in and tell me that they paid that money back, I'll tell you what I'll do. You give me $25 billion. I'll put it in a CD. I will pay you the money back 12 months later. How's that? Give me the ability to loan it out. You give me that money at 0% interest, and I promise you I will pay you back in a year and a half or 2 years. And then you will never hear from me again. I will be somewhere probably on the coast of Mexico in my own, bed and breakfast.
Bed and breakfast?
Well, I'm going to run a little bed and breakfast,
All
but
right.
I'm not going to charge anybody.
Very chill.
I will be in it.
Yeah.
Depends. It's like you are like sneaking up to this, like you sneak up to the rooftop pool. Like,
No, that's the way.
I don't want to talk about Social Security today.
Well, that's exactly. That's it. It's going to be very, very inexpensive, the bed and breakfast, with top quality stuff, but you get to listen to me.
Why
rant
isn't
at you,
I just
Elder.
want to do a lap, please? Why isn't anyone joining me in the commissary?
Hi, I'm in the commissary. The commissary's open. They're lying about the numbers.
Breakfast this morning's going to be very exciting.
You would
Well,
still
let's go
do.
to the phone.
You would just do a once a week.
That's what I'm
show.
saying. I would.
You
I
do
would
a once a week.
No,
show.
I would have a bed and breakfast and have like captured audience.
Literally, they can't
Literally,
leave.
that's right.
You'll
6
find
p.m. tonight.
that
You'll
the
hear
door is locked from the outside.
Those 19th century stories of bed and breakfast murders.
It's like a bed. It's like a version. It's a Twilight Zone episode.
one way intercom in all the rooms.
Good morning.
Good morning.
You might want
Here's
to
what we
freshen
have
up
today.
because we're talking about the actuarial report.
It
on Medicare
is
in 30 minutes.
Tuesday, April 30th.
Broadcasting live from what you thought was a dream vacation.
go to the phones. Calling from a 603 area code. Who's this? Where are you calling from?
Hey, Sam. This is James. I'm from Concord, New Hampshire. I've been a big fan of yours since you played Fenton Mully on Home Movies.
Oh.
And I'm a non-binary transgender person. I use the pronouns they and them.
Okay.
And there's an LGBTQ debate scheduled for October 10th, which is National Coming Out Day for the Democratic primary. To me, none of the Democrats are championing transgender rights. I'd say I'm a Bernie bro, but I'm not a man, so I'm not anybody's bro. But I saw Bernie talk in Concord, and he gave a stump speech where he lists all of his ethnic minorities, gays, people with all these identity politic issues, and I'm screaming there, and trans rights. Like, I'm not going to get any help from Trump because he's trying to legally make me erased, and which just literally that kills trans people to be erased. And so my question to you and the gang, who I also like, what is a Democratic transgender voter supposed to? Who's the choice? Because it's like Buttigieg. I don't give a fuck about Buttigieg. No national experience. We all know he kind of waged a war on his own poor in his hometown, and it's like that's your one. So it's like, what do you think a trans person is supposed to do in this Democratic primary?
Well, all I can tell you, well, let me first state I'm surprised that he didn't bring it up, because he did bring it up in Brooklyn at the rally I went to. But I mean, the reality is that I think there is some measure of I would bet. I mean, I don't know if this for sure, but some measure of fear amongst even the Democratic candidates to bring trans rights up. I mean, it Donald Trump is. I didn't want to run. I don't know if he ran on it, but I mean, certainly it was a big Republican talking point, right? The bathrooms, that came out of that Department of Education directive from the Obama administration. And you're right. I mean, Trump is not going to be any help. I don't know that any of the Democrats so far have come out as a particular champion of trans rights. I don't know about. I haven't heard Buttigieg mention it much. I wonder if I don't know. I mean, and let me just say this generically, because I don't want to. Like I say, I don't know. I haven't heard his speech, but one of the advantages from at least from research that Obama had in terms of race is that he didn't have to speak about it. Whereas Clinton had to speak about race a lot more, and it triggered a lot of racists in some respects more than Obama did. I mean, I think once Obama got into office, Fox News and the right did a very good job of making it as if his presidency was all about delivering, goodies to black people, the Obama cell phone and whatnot. So I don't know. I think my sense is.
And my thing though is that that's the fundamental problem of a democracy, is that if we don't have, because one party, the Republicans, there's no point in bringing it up. So it's like one party can't hold the other to account because neither of them are really trying to get my vote, because there's not enough of me.
Yeah. Yeah. I think your assessment is correct. And I think that they're going to rely on the fact that you have nowhere else to go. Now, with that said, somebody just sent me, a post that Bernie Sanders did on Facebook in February.
This is when the Trump administration was rolling back protections for transgender students specifically.
Specifically in terms of and
Right.
Bernie came out very strongly. With that said, I think you're going to have problems getting them to actively seek your vote in the context of a campaign, because they're afraid. And I think, your assessment is correct. There's, from their perspective, there's just not enough numbers. And,
you do make a great point about how, like, the fact that they can just lose more votes by talking about it than they would gain by talking about it.
I think that's their calculation, which is not to say that when any of these candidates get into office that they won't be aggressively championing trans rights. And in fact, I have no sense of all, there's so many candidates, frankly, but I'm quite confident that, the top 5 or 10 candidates would obviously be far better than Donald Trump on trans rights. And that once in office, that you're going to see, many of these things reversed and further protections going forward. I mean, even, Obama, who I count as someone who was very, very reluctant to identify with rights of any segment of the population that was specifically a subject of discrimination in many respects, by the end of his administration was putting out these directives and was trying to move things forward. I suspect that, these candidates are not going to campaign in the way that we would want them to in terms of trans rights, but would be more likely, and that is, and I'm not, I want to make it clear that I'm not being apologetic for it, and I understand that that's problematic in and of itself because you have, depending on the month, multiple trans people killed because they're trans, and the fact that we don't have
the people who kill themselves not directly because they're killed, but because they feel all those issues.
Right. And when politicians and just leaders in our country are silent, that silence in and of itself adds to creating those tragedies. And so, but the cold reality is, I think your assessment is correct. They think that there are more votes in most places for them to lose than to gain.
Well, look, to be fair, though, Bernie did hang the transgender flag outside of his office very recently on the Trans Day of Visibility. He had a tweet about it. He said, "Discrimination has no place in our society. I'm proud to display this flag as a symbol of my support for the transgender people across the country. We must stand with transgender people in all of our communities." And he has had a fairly good record
I'm
not
saying that there's a bad record. I'm just talking about in terms of like what you can expect on the campaign trail.
I also don't think, I think you're totally right, but I would just, because I remember it very, like it was part of the speech structure in Brooklyn. So I would check out, and I don't know, I'm going to check out too, but check out some of his other speeches, because it might have honestly just been, I mean, this sounds trivial in the context of how important what we're talking about is, but sometimes there's genuinely just like trip ups in a speech, and you miss lines and you miss things that you usually say and point to.
Or he stresses different things.
Or he
stresses
different.
Right.
I mean,
yeah, that's also possible.
And
but I would check it out.
You got to look at somebody's
That's a
record
good point.
to see what they're actually going to do in office, because talk is cheap. But I mean, Bernie Sanders, he opposed Don't Ask, Don't Tell. He opposed the discriminatory bathroom laws, and he opposed Donald Trump's push to ban transgender people from the military. And he took a number of measures when he was mayor of Burlington in the 80s to make it a safer place for LGBT people.
Yeah, he's been out for marriage equality.
And I agree that Bernie is really like the candidate in these regards. But to me, it's just it's what my biggest concern is, and it's not just this election moving forward. The fact that currently, at least, you can't talk about these issues. Therefore, you can't have the two parties can't compete, or they aren't competing for the attention, affection, and votes of trans people.
Yeah.
So that's my biggest fear is.
Well, on that level, they're not competing for the attention and affection of Hispanic people, African Americans, gay, that's the bigger thing, right? Is that one party is literally just the party of oligarchy and white identity politics. So that's a bigger, no doubt. You're totally right. But I think that affects basically all groups, of people.
Appreciate the call.
Oh, I just wanted to say also my solidarity to the Jewish community, and I just support all our Jewish allies.
Appreciate it. Thanks, James.
Thank you.
Hello? Just did that to annoy you.
Calling from a 702 area code. Who's this?
Hey, Sam, it's Bro Flamingo from Las Vegas.
Bro Flamingo, what's on your mind?
Hey, Sam, a couple of things. By the way, first of all, how was your trip and how was the vacation?
The vacation was not as restful as I had hoped, but Saul did learn to swim, so I was psyched about that.
Excellent, excellent. Let's get down to business. You know, we've seen the synagogue shooting, you know, and it's just becoming apparent that, you know, we're never going to crack down on these white supremacist thugs, or at least in this administration. And we have a serious problem, you know. And I think at the end of the day, look, when you have like vermin, like Meghan McCain, and, you know, other white wing trash running around talking about, you know, the violence on both sides and, you know, the rhetoric, okay, it's just really stupid, okay? You know, the equivocation, the false equivocations in the press is letting these guys slide. It's one of the most damaging and toxic things we can keep letting these guys get a pass on. I mean, you guys aren't. I mean, people in know aren't. But, you know, when the average Joe is sitting down and watching Meghan McCain spout this garbage, it's ridiculous. You know, it's absolutely ridiculous. Also, you know, we really need to have a task force, you know, cracking down on these guys. And I'm talking about, like, for example, you know, you look at the Parkland shooter, you look at the Sutherland Springs shooter. These guys have ties to terrorism. Well, I'll call them terror groups, you know what I'm saying, just for my contempt for these hateful idiots. But, you know, these terror groups, you know, these white supremacist terror cells, I mean, they get propaganda online, and the FBI won't investigate these guys. We have a problem now. I mean, it's become a full-blown problem. First, you know, you have a super under the rug, like, oh, little Timmy, he was mentally unstable, X, Y, and Z. But you can't keep doing that anymore. And you can just scratch the surface now, Sam. You see these guys have all types of ties to everybody. Like, again, the Sutherland Springs shooter, he had ties to Adam Walton. The Parkland shooter, you know what I'm saying? You know, he was a young guy, whatever, I understand. But, you know, he was in a Facebook group called America Great Again, where he's ranting about, I need to kill the N-words and the Jews. These guys are coming from a common source. Now, not every single one, but even guys like Elliot Rodger. You know, remember the Santa Barbara, UC Santa Barbara shooter, you know, because he was mad because all the white girls were going out with the black guys. I mean,
well, look, let me just say this. We as a nation assassinated a U.S. citizen in, I think it was in Yemen, who was ostensibly because he was, supposedly there was some type of operational ties he had, but primarily because he was, you know, the American imam, I guess they called him, al-Awlaki, and we assassinated him, and the biggest complaint we had was that he was radicalizing people online. And, I mean, so and my point in raising that is just like the level in which, as a government, we will take that seriously versus the radicalization that happens online. Now, obviously, look, you're dealing with similar profiles, you know, people who are aimless and who have perhaps you know, various emotional or mental issues that are susceptible to these things. You know, and obviously very rarely does this occur, but we have 300 million people in the country. And so, you know, when you're talking about, you know, particularly young white males, in this case, because that's who these people are.
The thing is, though,
I mean,
the thing is, though, because go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well,
and I just wanted to say, so I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, because I agree with what you're saying. But my main beef with the coverage of this, you know, kind of the thoughts and prayers and the mental issues is that the ties to the white supremacists are never brought up. You know what I'm saying? Of course we can mitigate the other things like, you know, the economics, you know, the failing school systems. I mean, that stuff is clearly there. But nobody wants to mention that these guys are going online. Of course, you know.
Well, yeah, that's my point. Is that that's all the other societal ills exist. And so, you know, the radicalization online is a problem. And we've had attempts in the past. The DOJ has attempted to, you know, formalize the investigations into this stuff. And there was too much pushback by the Republicans, frankly. And, you know, Donald Trump has already disassembled the team at the Department of Justice that dealt with this stuff. So, I mean, yeah, we're going to get more of this. And we got to wait until we get a different administration in there who's going to take this threat seriously.
I would just like to add, like, I mean, let me just be a little bit flippant for a second. Like, I'd like to see the response to the problems that emanate from groups that identify as Muslim to start be treated in that more, you know, economic and, you know, life purpose sense that someone like Scott Atran writes about. So I think, like, I agree with you when they say, like, oh, little Timmy's disturbed, whatever, is a way to minimize the connections to white supremacy. But I'd actually like to see, like, little Akbar is disturbed, and to start actually treating these things in a real systemic, humane way across the board.
Yeah, I don't want to see more people labeled as terrorists.
Right.
I would like to see fewer people labeled as terrorists. And I would also caution against leaning too heavily on the police and the carceral state to prosecute crimes of white supremacist violence, because if you look at the history of the police in the carceral state, it's deeply intertwined with white supremacist violence, and you really can't trust them.
No, absolutely. To Jamie's point, by the way, because again, really good book with Kathleen Ballou. You know, between the Fort Smith trials, the Greenboro massacres, you know, even the Timothy McVeigh, these guys always just seem to lose their courtroom mojo when some white supremacist trash is on trial. Oh, you know, we overcharged them. Oh, you know, the evidence, and sometimes even get sympathy from the jurors. You know what I'm saying? There has to be a different strategy to this, because clearly, I mean, besides neglect, of prosecuting these guys, anytime you get them in the courtroom, you know, even that Coast Guard guy just got let off.
Yeah.
Oh, you know, we're trying to hold him. That's ridiculous.
That's insane. I mean, that's ridiculous on even the value, you know, that I would put, which is that I basically think, like, unless somebody is a clear and present danger, I'm not a big prison person. Okay, so the guy who, I think this was in February, I think we were on break, which is why we didn't cover it. He had a hit list and was attempting to set off Armageddon. I mean, but this guy had a stockpile. He was a Coast Guard guy. He's someone who, as I say, I think could potentially be an active threat now, as far as I understand those charges. So this isn't even about retribution. This is about keeping people safe in the present moment. He was let out on bail. That is unbelievable.
All right, appreciate the call, man.
Insane, you know what I'm saying?
I'm sorry, I got to jump. I got only 10 minutes left. I got to go. But yeah,
yes, sir.
Points well taken. Appreciate it. All right, I got time for one more call, and then we're going to take some IMs and get going. Calling from a 202 area code. Who's this? Where are you calling from?
Hi, I'm calling from Washington, D.C.
Yeah, who's this?
Claxton.
Claxton, what's on your mind?
Well, actually, I wanted to talk about Sudan and what's going on there, and like how the movement that's leading the revolution that's ongoing there starts out in professional unions, lawyers, veterinarians, pharmacists, and I really had questions more for you guys about the praxis of that kind of mobilization. And just to give a little background, if you're not so familiar with the union, that is the Professionals Association, that is kind of like the central kind of coordination group. This started out as a shadow union because the unions had been corrupted by the regimes. And in terms of providing support for the doctors and whatever the profession in the field. And so the workers started, these professionals started working together in sort of setting up things like a gamaya, which is a way for people to save money together and things like that. And out of this, over the 30 years of this current regime, they mobilized and became political into such a degree now that they are and pushing a very radical agenda. I'm not sure if you're familiar, but they're suggesting for the transitionary period, 4 years, a legislative council made up of 40% women. I mean, I would like to see that number higher personally, but that is big, and taking out all religious discrimination out of it, and no political parties for the 4-year transition in government. So, and they're getting, so far, alhamdulillah, it's going well, but So what can we learn from that here in the United States as far as organizing? And that was the end. And earlier to the point, the caller earlier about the trans issues. And I am also very disappointed that there isn't a specific policy around it. And I don't see how Medicare for All cannot be something that can incorporate trans rights, because in Washington, D.C., we have an insane murder and suicide rate for trans people because transitioning is so expensive, they end up on the streets. And that's where they get murdered and all this stuff. But like if in the UK, if we cover transitioning through our healthcare system, and when we have such a massive central healthcare system, these costs are negligible to us. We would, I feel, I mean, I'm not an expert, I know nothing, but I feel like that would alleviate a lot of the problems that trans people have.
Yeah, it would alleviate some anyways, and I agree with you. We're talking about the amount of money that we're talking about is minuscule, and it should be. You know, we need to see these things incorporated into policy, and you know. But I also don't want to be naive about this. I think there's a lot of fear amongst these politicians, and it's and at one point it really has to be that. From a societal perspective, we need to demand of our politicians that, like, look, you have to be inclusive. You have to have a broader perspective on this, and that requires, us to practice solidarity.
Exactly, Sam. And also for Bernie, I was very disappointed when he went to the We the Women, We the Change. I'm not familiar, an organization of predominantly people.
She the People,
color.
I think it was, yeah.
And you can lead with Medicare for All because in the black community, how they suffer the worst consequences of the lack of a medical system, and there's built-in discrimination against black women and black men via treatment. And you could lead with that and not like, oh, I walked with Martin Luther and I was friends with Jesse Jackson. I don't understand. I can make a better argument than he's making. It doesn't make sense.
Well,
as appealing to minorities and people who are suffering, in vulnerable communities.
I think there's some truth to that. I will also say that he is sort of like he's a little bit damned if he does, damned if he doesn't, because that was what you just described was his argument in 2016, was that these economic proposals that I am proposing will necessarily have a greater and targeted impact on communities of color and of communities that have been left behind, just broadly speaking. And he was considered, he got a rap of not understanding that these issues are not economic. And so, I think he's still working, I think, on how to express that, but I get your point.
Yeah, he doesn't always do the best job connecting the dots. I think a lot of the time people have to do it themselves. But I think he is getting better at it on all of these things. And specifically, like, he's been portrayed as a bit of a class reductionist. I think he definitely cares about all of these issues. He cares about patriarchy. He cares about white supremacy. He doesn't always do the best job connecting those things to class in the economic realm. But I do think he's getting better.
Plaxton, I appreciate the phone call.
Oh, and any chance for Sudan? Anything about the Sudan especially? I would like to hear from Jamie.
Michael's going to cover some of that tonight.
Yeah, I need to learn more about it before I can comment in an educated way. Maybe I'll watch the Michael Brooks show later.
Appreciate the call. All right, let's take some IMs, folks. I'm sorry we were out of time for phone calls. Colin from Nebraska. Jamie, I finally listened to the Antifada this past Friday. Really enjoyed it. I listened to the Gay Luxury Space Communism episode with Will Menaker. Have to say my brain is still in recovery mode.
Oh, I thank you.
Leave Sage.
I'll take it as a compliment.
The farther I go down this progressive road, the more I realize that everything about my country is a complete lie. For my own sanity and well-being, I have to believe that we can change. Otherwise, what's the point? Thanks, MR Crew, for all you do.
Read Thomas Paine.
Read Thomas Paine.
A Square. Welcome back, MR. Wow, that background music on the Rubens drop, Matt, was a nice touch. I must admit, I tuned out a bit on the news while you were away. I feel like an endless loop of bad news and the lawlessness of the mad baby king in his court. Last week, Girl Down interview was great. Thank you. Dawson from Minneapolis. Sam, say intifada. Now say anti-Antil. Yeah, no, I said intifada this morning. Scott from Montana. Quick point about the Guano Island Act. It wasn't the U.S. government claiming these islands. It was private U.S. citizens who had their claims backed by the president. Privatized empire building. Interesting. Bravo-matic. Per BBC, Indonesia is moving its capital from Jakarta due to traffic congestion and climate change. Researchers say the large parts of megacity could be entirely submerged by 2050. Yeah, I heard that. Chris Lapaco, any thoughts about Jacob Wall-Land, his daddy getting busted for trying to frame Mayor Pete for sexual assault? Yeah, we'll talk about that tomorrow. I got that story. But yeah, it's nuts. Think he'll ever get locked up for these type of shenanigans? That was the one thing we were saying right before the show. It was like, what's it take to get sent to jail for, constantly trying to do these public smears? I mean, he tried to do it for the special prosecutor, for God's sakes. Or get a ticket.
If you can go at Mueller with you gotta feel bold after going after Mueller and nothing happened.
Yeah, apparently you can just keep doing this. And why isn't Twitter ban his feed? Anybody associated, all he's doing is putting out lies. I don't get it.
Jack Dorsey is not our friend.
Read the Jack Dorsey interview in the New Yorker, dude.
Gregory from Oklahoma. I just got fired from my part-time job at McDonald's today, and the manager didn't give me a reason why. I'm starting to think it might be because I tweeted one too many articles about how badly McDonald's handles sexual harassment with their workplace. Honestly, I have no idea why. Gregory, really sorry to hear that. I hope you find another job soon. Nick from Manitoba. Hey, Sam, great show today. Thus far, I wanted to make a moment to inquire, how's your tuchus? I see you working hard 4 to 5 days a week, sitting in that chair, bringing down the facts and logic hammer, and I'm worried that sitting is taking a toll on your tushy. I hope you're taking measures like exercise and stretching to avoid getting those, hemorrhoids. Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that, Nick. That's very sweet. Yes, of course. Can you stretch away hemorrhoids? Is that the way it works? USA Today, opinion published by Bernie Sanders. Everyone deserves to vote, even felons like Paul Manafort and Michael Cohen. MR, look at Elizabeth Warren responses to Chase's awful tweet. It was great. Pat, MD, called in yesterday to talk about Bernie's appearance at She the People, but after listening more closely and seeing Zerlina Maxwell basically lie about it on Bill Maher, I'm not worried about it anymore. The so-called woke crowd can't help but bring out the most petty and hacky arguments, and I think your average Democratic primary voter will see through that. Pajama Boy. So I've donated to Bernie, Warren, and unfortunately Buttigieg. I feel like there was one episode a while back where you guys talked nicely about him and I threw some money. In retrospect, I'm mad that I did that, but I dreamed that you guys were kind to him prior to finding more about him.
We just said that he was better than Beto O'Rourke, but my God, don't give...
Yeah, no.
Just because somebody's vaguely praised. Yeah, exactly. If there's any... if it's not Sanders, give Ilhan Omar money.
Yeah, most I've said is he signals correctly, but about progressive and leftist
I think we just said if you were
policies,
looking for
that
an
was a while
empty
ago.
suit in their 40s, Buttigieg is slightly more interesting than O'Rourke, although now I like O'Rourke better.
Bill Pilgrim, Obama could have used a recess appointment to put Garland on the Supreme Court between sessions of Congress. People were calling for him to do it at the time. There was a lot of debate as to whether he could. I mean, I know I remember those arguments. And I know that Dan had that point. But there was one move that he could have used. I can't remember what it was, but I will look back into that. Wu-Tech Clan. I just finished my junior year as a computer science student at WPI. I took a required course on the social implications of computing this term, which was a great idea, but it was taught by a libertarian from Raytheon. Not good. I spent a lot of time on Highland Street, Boynton Pizza. Sam Snuff Stash. Both Fox and CNN are currently citing Biden's lead in a SSRS poll that had NA respondents between the age of 18 to 49. Yeah, I heard some weird thing about that. All right, 3 more of these things. We'll get to that other clips tomorrow because I want to do that Yeah, the one that Maddow did about the gender too. Sean, Sam, gender equality will destabilize the family unit because then women won't have any reason to stay barefoot and pregnant in the kitchen. Colleen from Connecticut. If I remember correctly, it was Flake, not Cruz on that flight. I think you might be right. Michael's butthole. Okay. Thought on the Zizek-Peterson debate and dunk on Shapiro more often, please. Didn't see that debate.
I watched it. I thought it was worthwhile watching because it's very funny how Zizek sort of more or less and less politely tells Jordan Peterson that he doesn't know Marx
From what
at
I
all.
saw, Zizek did an amazing job.
Yeah, I thought it was entertaining. Zizek has some really trash opinions about trans people and immigrants that I've heard him express, but in the context of that debate, I think he got maybe some of the lobster boys to move from the alt-right to realizing that Peterson is a total idiot and that, this Marxism stuff might be kind of cool.
And the final IM of the day.
Bored up today.
Yeah. JJ Cool, who needs Medicare for all when you can go beg wealthy people for financial assistance? Much like Yelp, I'm sure Dave Rubin would recommend GoFundMe as a market solution. See you tomorrow.
It might take all the strength I got to get to where I want, but I know somehow I'm gonna get there. I wasn't looking when I just got caught between the truth and the light bar.